Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. One of our subscribers sent me a story that shook me to the core, an experience so horrifying, so unexplainable, that I just have to share it with you. The first thing I noticed was that the house should not have been there. I had driven this stretch of Blackwood Road at least a dozen times in the past year, inspecting foreclosures, condemned buildings, and properties left to rot by owners who either died or simply disappeared. But this house, I had never seen it before. It stood at the end of a long, unpaved driveway, shrouded in the skeletal arms of blackened trees, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow it whole. The architecture was old, early Victorian, with a steeply pitched roof and stained glass windows that caught the dying light of the evening sun. The wood was weathered but strangely intact, and the entire structure seemed to lean slightly to one side, as though struggling to hold itself upright. There was something unnatural about it, something wrong, but the job was already paid for, and I wasn't about to turn around just because a house made me feel uneasy. I parked my truck at the edge of the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the engine as it cooled. The email I had received earlier that day had been short and vague, an anonymous request for a full home inspection with a generous advance wired to my account before I even agreed. No names, no contact information, just an address and an insistence that the job be completed by midnight. That should have been my first red flag. No one asked for midnight inspections, but greed has a way of dulling instincts, and I had bills to pay. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against gravel as I made my way toward the porch. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. A wind picked up suddenly, sharp and cold, rattling the dead branches above me. The closer I got, the more I felt an unshakable sensation creeping up my spine, a feeling I couldn't quite place. Not fear, not exactly. It was more like recognition, like some part of me already knew this place even though I had never seen it before. The front door was unlocked. That wasn't surprising. Most abandoned properties were either broken into long before I got to them, or simply left open, forgotten by time. But what did surprise me was the handle. It wasn't rusted, wasn't loose or weathered like the rest of the house. It was clean, polished, untouched. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the brass knob. There was something about this house that made my stomach tighten, something that made me want to turn back, get in my truck, and pretend I had never seen it. But the job was already paid for, and I wasn't about to lose my reputation over a bad feeling. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, burnt wood and something else, something sweet, rotting beneath the surface. The air inside was warm, unnaturally so, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to step inside before exhaling. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight as I stepped over the threshold, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the foyer. The place was pristine. No dust, no cobwebs, nothing to suggest it had been abandoned for decades. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the dim light from the stained glass windows. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its pendulum swinging in perfect, soundless rhythm. The furniture looked expensive, untouched by time. Dark mahogany chairs, an antique velvet couch, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. That was when I saw it. A single cup of tea, still steaming, sitting on the small table beside the couch. I took a step back, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Someone was here. Someone had been here moments ago. But the house had been silent when I entered. No movement, no footsteps. And yet, the tea was still hot. Then from somewhere deeper inside the house, I heard it. A whisper. My name. I stayed completely still, gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached, listening to the sound of my own breathing as it echoed too loudly in the room. The whisper had come from somewhere deeper in the house, but the air was thick and heavy, distorting the direction of the sound, making it feel like it had come from everywhere at once. I scanned the room again, looking for any sign of movement, but nothing had changed. The tea still sat steaming on the table. The furniture remained perfectly in place, and the grandfather clock's pendulum continued to swing in eerie silence. There was no dust, no signs of decay, nothing that suggested this house had been abandoned. The only thing out of place was me. I forced myself to move, stepping carefully into the center of the room, scanning every doorway, every shadow, every corner where something or someone could be watching. The floorboards beneath me groaned softly, but the sound felt wrong, muffled, like the wood wasn't completely solid. I ignored the feeling and kept moving, stepping toward the doorway at the far end of the foyer, the one that led deeper into the house. The air seemed to grow warmer the further I went, the smell of burnt wood and something sickly sweet growing stronger. I reached the doorway and stopped, shining my flashlight into the hallway beyond. The walls were lined with portraits, old and faded, their subjects staring blankly forward, their expressions indistinct. The light from my flashlight flickered slightly as I moved forward, the beam dimming for just a moment before returning to full strength. I ignored it and kept going, passing closed doors on either side of the hallway, each one identical, each one appearing untouched. My footsteps felt too loud in the silence, the sound swallowed up by the thick air. Then I heard it again. "Daniel." The whisper came from behind one of the doors, low, deliberate, spoken just loud enough to be heard but not enough to determine exactly where it had come from. I stopped, my body tensing, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, to get out of this house and never come back. But my feet didn't move, my body frozen between fear and something else, something I couldn't quite name. I reached for the nearest door, my fingers barely brushing the handle before I heard it again. "Daniel." It came from behind me this time. I turned fast, sweeping the flashlight back down the hallway. But there was nothing there, nothing but the silent portrait staring blankly ahead. My breathing was too loud now, my pulse hammering in my ears. But I forced myself to move, forcing my legs to take another step toward the door at the end of the hallway. Something about it felt different, heavier, as if it was more real than the others, more solid. I reached out and turned the handle, pushing it open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The room was a study, large and filled with rows of tall bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling. A large wooden desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in papers and an old leather-bound book. The air in here was heavier than in the rest of the house, thicker, as if the walls were pressing inward. I moved toward the desk, my flashlight passing over the papers, scanning the faintly written words, but they made no sense. Sentences cut off mid-thought, words scrawled too fast, overlapping, repeating. Some pages were torn, the edges darkened, as if burned. But the book in the center of the desk was untouched, its cover pristine, its spine unbroken. I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the leather, every door in the house slammed shut at once. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat, spinning around, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I aimed it at the doorway. The room behind me was unchanged, but the feeling in the air had shifted, thick with something unseen, something watching. The silence was different now, heavier, as if the house itself was waiting. I turned back to the book, forcing myself to open it, the pages thick beneath my fingers. The writing inside was small, cramped, the ink faded with age, but the words were clear. "If you are reading this, then it has already begun." My breath caught in my throat. The words blurred slightly, my eyes struggling to focus, the ink shifting on the page as if the letters were moving. I flipped to another page, my pulse hammering, reading the next line before I could stop myself. Do not look at it. Do not speak to it. Do not run. I didn't have time to process what it meant before I felt it. A presence standing directly behind me. I could feel it in the air, the temperature dropping instantly, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I didn't turn around. I didn't move. I could hear something breathing, slow and deliberate, just inches away, too close, too real. My fingers clenched the edge of the book, my mind racing, every muscle locked in place, knowing that whatever was behind me was waiting. Then, in the silence, I heard the softest sound, a single step. It was moving toward me. I did not turn around. I did not breathe. I stayed completely still, gripping the edge of the desk, my fingers digging into the wood so hard that I could feel the grooves pressing into my skin. The air behind me was cold, impossibly cold, thick with the scent of something old and damp, like wood that had been left to rot in a sealed room. The breathing was steady, slow, deliberate, close enough that I could hear the faint hitch in its rhythm, as if it was testing the space between us, waiting for something. Another step, closer this time. The boards groaned beneath its weight, the sound warping, stretching unnaturally long before fading into silence. It was right behind me. I forced myself to move, my fingers inching toward the book, flipping another page as if reading was the only thing that mattered, as if I had not noticed the thing standing just inches away. The words swam on the page, but I forced my eyes to focus, forcing myself to read. Do not acknowledge it. It will wait. It will listen, but it does not yet know you see it. Another step. The air felt like it was pressing against my back, something just out of sight, leaning closer, waiting for the moment I would break. My pulse was hammering, my chest aching from the effort of keeping my breath slow, controlled, even when everything in my body was screaming to move, to run, to get out of this house. I turned the page again. It will not touch you if it does not know you see it. If you turn, if you react, it will know. It will not stop. My throat tightened. I could feel something shifting, the presence behind me no longer just standing, but leaning, close enough that the air felt like it was thick with weight, like something was pressing down on my shoulders. My vision was starting to blur at the edges, my body too tense, too still, every nerve locked in place. I needed to move. I needed to leave. I turned the page. You cannot run. It does not move the way you do. If you try, it will follow. It will be there before you reach the door. A sound. Low. Almost imperceptible. Not a whisper. Not quite. A shift of air. The faintest movement. A presence adjusting itself. My hands were sweating, my grip slipping against the book, my breathing too shallow now, my chest tight, the weight pressing down harder. Another page. There is only one way to leave. Do not run. Do not turn. Walk. Slowly. If it moves, do not react. Do not look at the mirrors. Do not look at the glass. Do not listen to the voices. I swallowed hard. My legs felt locked in place, my knees weak, my body heavy with the unbearable knowledge that it was still there. I could hear the slow, steady breathing, the cold pressing against my skin, the weight of its presence filling the space between us. I could feel my own pulse hammering so hard that my vision blurred, my ears ringing, but I forced myself to breathe. Then for the first time, it moved, not a step, not a breath, something else. A shift in the air, a change in the silence, the undeniable sensation of something leaning closer. The book trembled in my hands, my fingers barely holding onto the pages as I forced myself to move, slow, controlled, deliberate. I straightened, keeping my eyes forward, locking them on the doorway ahead. The breathing behind me did not stop. The presence did not shift. It was waiting. I took a step. The floor creaked beneath me, the weight of the air pressing harder against my shoulders. Another step. Slow. Measured. The breathing did not change. The presence did not move. I stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, thick with the same unnatural stillness, the same wrongness that had been there from the beginning. The portraits on the walls were the same, their faces blurred, indistinct, watching without eyes. The air was heavier now, filled with something unseen, something pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the space between each doorway. Another step. The floor creaked. Something behind me moved. Not a breath, not a whisper, not the slow, steady presence that had been waiting. This was different. This was movement. Something shifting, something adjusting itself, something reacting to the fact that I had moved. My hands were trembling, my breath shallow, but I did not stop. I walked. I moved past the first door, then the second. The air did not change. The silence did not break. The weight of something unseen followed behind me, never touching, never speaking, never reacting beyond that single shift, that single change in the air that told me it knew. I reached the foyer. The grandfather clock was still there, its pendulum swinging in soundless rhythm, the furniture untouched, the cup of tea still sitting on the table, steam rising from its surface. The door was ahead, only a few steps away. I forced myself to keep moving, each step slow, deliberate, my body locked in the unbearable effort of not reacting. Then, just before I reached the door, I heard the voice again. Not a whisper this time, not behind me, not distant, right next to my ear. Do not leave. I felt the breath against my skin. Cold, close, real. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door, gripping the handle, my pulse hammering so loudly that I couldn't hear the silence anymore. Couldn't feel anything but the unbearable weight of the presence behind me. The handle turned beneath my grip, smooth, effortless, as if the house was letting me go. Then, just as I pulled the door open, the voice spoke again. "You'll come back." The air behind me shifted. The weight lifted. I stepped outside. The air outside was different. It was thick, unmoving, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the heat or the dampness of the night. I could still feel the house behind me, could still feel the weight of whatever had been standing in that room, whatever had whispered into my ear. The ground beneath my boots felt unstable, the gravel too soft, as if I was stepping onto something that wasn't entirely real. I did not look back. I forced myself to keep walking, my steps slow, my legs heavy, my body locked in the overwhelming effort of not running. I did not breathe until I reached my truck, until my hands were gripping the door handle so tightly that my knuckles ached, until I could feel the solid metal beneath my fingers, something real, something that existed outside of whatever was inside that house. I yanked the door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me, locking it, gripping the steering wheel so hard that my arms shook. The air inside the truck was stale, the lingering smell of old coffee and sweat hanging in the closed space. But it was better than the air outside, better than the feeling of standing on that driveway with my back to that house. My hands fumbled for the keys, my fingers slipping against the ignition, too slick with sweat, too unsteady. I forced them to work, forced the key to turn, forced the engine to roar to life. The sound was too loud, jarring, the only real thing in the suffocating silence of the night. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the driveway ahead looked different, longer than I remembered. The trees on either side pressing in too close, the path stretching into something that should not have been there. I pressed my foot against the gas pedal, forcing the truck forward, the tires crunching against the gravel, the steering wheel vibrating beneath my grip. The trees blurred past, the headlights barely reaching beyond the suffocating darkness, the air outside refusing to move, refusing to shift. The driveway stretched longer and longer, the road ahead twisting in ways that did not make sense, looping back, curving inward, keeping me inside. My pulse was hammering, my breath coming too fast, my hands clenched so tightly around the wheel that my fingers felt numb. The house was behind me, but I could feel it still, could feel the presence of it pressing against my back. Watching, waiting. The dashboard clock was wrong. The numbers flickered, shifting between times that did not exist, cycling through hours that should not have passed. The radio crackled, a burst of static filling the cabin before a voice, distorted, low, barely audible, spoke through the speakers. "You'll come back." I slammed my fist against the radio, the static cutting out, the voice vanishing, the silence returning heavier than before. The trees blurred past faster now, the road beneath me twisting, the headlights barely reaching beyond the suffocating dark. The driveway could not have been this long. I should have reached the main road by now. My grip on the wheel tightened, my foot pressing harder against the gas, the truck shuddering beneath me as the engine strained, the tires gripping against the gravel that never seemed to end. Then, without warning, the road opened up. The trees fell away, the headlights finally cutting through the dark, revealing the main road stretching out ahead. My body lurched forward as I slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just before the asphalt, the tires kicking up dust, the entire frame shaking. My breath was too fast, my hands shaking, my entire body locked in the effort of trying to convince myself that I had made it out, that I was no longer in that place, that I had left whatever had been in that house behind. I did not look back. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel, my foot pressing against the gas, the truck lurching forward onto the highway, leaving the driveway behind. The air outside felt different now, lighter, thinner, as if something had been released, as if something had let me go. The town was empty when I reached it. The streets were dark, the traffic lights flickering, the buildings standing in perfect silence. I drove without thinking, my body moving on autopilot, my mind struggling to process what had happened, struggling to make sense of the time that did not add up, the voice that had spoken my name, the presence that had been standing behind me in that house. I parked in front of my motel, staring at the worn-out neon sign flickering in the window, the empty parking lot stretching out around me. The world felt different now, thinner, less real, as if I had stepped out of something I was not supposed to leave. My hands were still shaking when I reached for the door handle, when I stepped out onto the pavement, when I walked toward my room, the key heavy in my pocket. The night air was warm, still normal, but I could still feel it. I could still feel the house. I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, staring at the window, listening for something that was no longer there, but had not truly left. The hours blurred together, the clock on the wall shifting forward too fast, the night slipping away in seconds that did not feel real. I could still hear the voice. I could still feel the presence. I could still remember the words written in that book, the warning scrawled across the pages, the instructions that had saved me, that had told me how to leave. I had left, but the words had been clear. "You will come back." The next morning did not feel real. The sunlight through the motel window was pale, washed out, as if it was struggling to push through something unseen. The clock on the nightstand read 10 past 8, but I did not trust it. I did not trust time anymore. The hours had stretched and folded inside that house, the night refusing to pass the way it should have, and I could not shake the feeling that I had not escaped as cleanly as I wanted to believe. My body felt wrong, my skin too tight, my limbs heavy in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. The air in the motel room was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old carpet. But beneath it, something else lingered, something faint, something that should not have followed me here. I did not pack my bag. I left everything as it was, stepping outside with only my keys and phone, my boots scraping against the cracked pavement as I walked to my truck. The air was thick, too still, the town too quiet for a weekday morning. There should have been people walking, cars passing, the usual noise of life moving forward, but the streets were empty. The gas station across the road had its lights on, but no one stood at the pumps. The convenience store sign flickered, but no customers moved inside. I stood by my truck for a long moment, staring at the empty parking lot, at the silence stretching around me, at the way the world felt just a little bit off, just a little too still. I pulled my phone from my pocket, checking for messages, for anything, but the screen showed nothing. No signal, no notifications, just a blank, unresponsive void where my connection to the world should have been. I turned it off and back on. Nothing changed. I tried to call someone, anyone, but the call did not go through. The sound of dead air filled my ears, stretching longer than it should have, and I ended the call before I could hear anything else, before something that should not be there answered. I climbed into my truck, gripping the steering wheel with hands that still did not feel steady, my body still not convinced that I had actually left that house, that I had actually made it out. The drive out of town should have been easy. I knew the roads, knew the way back to the main highway, but something about the route felt off. The turns not quite where I remembered, the streets stretching too long or cutting too short. The houses looked the same, but the details were wrong. The mailboxes in the wrong places, the street signs unfamiliar even though I had driven past them before. I kept driving, forcing myself forward, watching the road, refusing to look too closely at the buildings, at the windows, at the dark spaces between them where something might be standing, watching. The highway should have been busy. It was the only route in and out of town, the main connection to the rest of the state. But as I drove, I saw no other cars, no movement, no signs of life beyond the endless stretch of road disappearing into the horizon. The gas gauge hovered just above half a tank, the needle not moving even after 30 minutes of driving. My phone still had no signal. The clock on the dashboard flickered, shifting numbers too fast, the minutes rolling forward in seconds before freezing completely. Then the road changed. The trees thickened, pressing closer to the pavement, their branches stretching overhead, filtering the sunlight into something dim, something pale. The road signs disappeared, the pavement cracking, breaking, the paint on the asphalt faded into nothing. I slowed down, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath too shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had been driving straight, had not turned, had not veered off course, but the road ahead was not the highway anymore. I knew this road. I recognized the trees, the way the branches stretched too far, the way the air felt wrong, pressing down, watching. The truck slowed to a crawl, the engine rumbling beneath me, the tires rolling over gravel instead of pavement. I did not want to keep driving. I did not want to see what was ahead, but I already knew. The driveway was waiting. The same unpaved stretch of road. The same dead trees pressing in from both sides. The same rusted iron gate, standing open, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, my fingers numb against the steering wheel, my entire body frozen in place. I had left. I had driven away. I had made it out. The house should not be here. I slammed the truck into reverse, my foot pressing hard against the gas, the tires spinning against the gravel, kicking up dust. But the road behind me was already gone. The trees had closed in, the path swallowed by the forest, the sky above dimming into something that was not evening, was not night, but was not daylight either. The air was too thick, too heavy, pressing against the windows, pressing against the glass, something unseen wrapping around the truck, pulling it back, pulling it forward. The driveway stretched ahead, leading to the house, leading to the front porch, to the door that had been unlocked the first time I arrived. The house stood in the same place, untouched, waiting, its windows dark, its presence pressing against the air, filling the space around it. My breath came too fast, my chest too tight, my pulse hammering so hard that my vision blurred, but I could not move, could not look away. Then the truck engine died. The radio crackled. The dashboard clock reset to midnight. And from the speakers, through the static, through the silence, the voice spoke again. "You came back." That's where the story ends. He thought he'd escaped, thought he'd put the nightmare behind him, but some places don't let you go that easily. If you have a horror story, real or fictional, that you'd like to share, send it to us via email. We'll feature the best ones in our next few videos. Until next time, sleep with the lights on.